My name is Melissa Mercer. I'm 27 years old. And the last thing my mother said to me in front of our entire family at Christmas dinner was this: "We don't talk about Melissa's situation. It's embarrassing enough as it is." 41 people at that table. Cousins, aunts, uncles, my grandmother, my father's business partners who somehow always ended up at our holiday gatherings, and not one of them flinched. Because they'd heard versions of that sentence for 6 years. The broke one. The one who couldn't get it together. The daughter who was too proud to ask for help and too lost to find her own way. That's who I was to them. That's the story my mother told, and she told it so well, so consistently, so convincingly, that by the time I was 26 even I had started to believe it. What none of them knew, what not a single person at that table had any idea about, was that the daughter they'd written off had been building something in the background for 3 years. Quietly. Deliberately. Without a single person's blessing. And on that same Christmas night, while my mother was still performing her grief over my existence to whoever would listen, my uncle's phone buzzed on the dinner table. And everything my mother had spent 6 years constructing came apart in under 4 minutes. But I need to take you back. Because the story doesn't start at that dinner table. It starts in Fresno, California on a Tuesday afternoon in September, when I was 21 years old and my phone rang with news that ended one version of my life and quietly began another. Before I go any further, if this story is already hitting somewhere familiar, if you've ever been the one at the table that everyone talks about instead of to, hit subscribe. I put out stories like this every week, and I promise you this one is worth staying for. Now let me take you back to where it all started. September 2018. I was a junior at California State University, Fresno. Business administration minor in marketing. I wasn't the top of my class, but I worked hard. I had a part-time job at a shipping logistics office on Blackstone Avenue, answering phones and organizing freight manifests for a salary that barely covered my half of the rent on the apartment I shared with 2 other girls in the Tower District. I liked my life. It was small and a little tight, but it was mine, and I was proud of it in the quiet way you're proud of things you built without any help. My mother, Linda Mercer, had a different view of my life. She thought the apartment was beneath me, the job was a placeholder, and the degree I was working toward wasn't impressive enough to mention at dinner parties. My older sister Courtney had gone to USC on a partial scholarship, graduated with a finance degree, and landed a job at a wealth management firm in Newport Beach before she was 23. That was the benchmark. That was the ceiling I was always being held up to and found lacking. I never resented Courtney for it. She worked hard and earned everything she had. I resented the way my mother used her as a measuring stick she pressed against my back every time she needed to remind me how short I was falling. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday. It wasn't from my mother. It wasn't from Courtney. It was from my Aunt Patrice, my father's older sister, who lived in a small house on the east side of Fresno about 4 miles from campus. "Melissa, honey," she said. "Your Uncle Dale had a heart attack this morning. He's at Community Regional. They don't know yet." I was sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store when she said it. I remember staring at a shopping cart someone had left in the middle of the lane and thinking somebody needs to move that. My brain does strange things when it's afraid. Uncle Dale wasn't just my father's brother. He was the man who taught me how to negotiate my first paycheck, who mailed me a card every single birthday with a crisp $50 bill folded inside, who called me on random Wednesdays just to ask how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. He was 54 years old and he had a heart attack loading boxes in his garage on a Tuesday morning, and I was 4 miles away. I drove to Community Regional immediately. I didn't call my mother first. I didn't call anyone. I just drove. Dale survived the initial event, but the doctors were cautious. He needed surgery, then recovery, then cardiac rehabilitation 3 times a week for at least 4 months. Aunt Patrice was a school administrator. She couldn't take a leave of absence. Their son Marcus was in the Navy, stationed overseas. There was no one. I sat in that hospital waiting room under fluorescent lights that buzzed like something trapped, and I understood with the kind of clarity you only get in crisis that the choice in front of me wasn't really a choice at all. It was just the truth showing itself. I went to my academic advisor the following Monday. Dr. Ellen Cho, patient woman, always had a cup of green tea on her desk. I explained the situation. She pulled up my file, looked at my records and said, "You've earned a medical family leave. Take it. Your credits are safe. Come back when you can." I signed the paperwork on a Wednesday. By Friday I had moved my things out of the Tower District apartment and into Dale and Patrice's spare room on the east side, 2 miles from the hospital, close enough to drive him to rehab before Patrice left for work every morning. Then I called my mother. I told her I was taking a leave. I told her why. The line went quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that isn't processing, it's calculating. Then she said, "Melissa, Dale is your father's family. Your father can handle that." I said, "Dad's in Sacramento until March, Mom. There's no one else." Another silence. Then, "How long?" "For months, maybe more." I heard her exhale, long and slow, the kind of exhale that carries an entire opinion inside it. "This is going to set you back," she said. Not, "I'm proud of you." Not, "That's the right thing to do." Just, "This is going to set you back." I stood in Patrice's kitchen holding the phone against my ear, and I watched Dale through the doorway, sitting in his recliner with a pillow pressed against his chest incision, watching the evening news with the volume too loud. I said, "I know, Mom." And I hung up. I want to tell you what the next 4 months looked like, because nobody tells you the unglamorous version of doing the right thing. I woke up at 6 every morning to drive Dale to cardiac rehab at St. Agnes. I sat in the waiting room with a textbook I was no longer enrolled to need, reading about market analysis and consumer behavior while my uncle learned how to walk up a flight of stairs without his heart betraying him. I came home, made lunch, helped Patrice with the grocery run, and spent my evenings doing freelance work. Anything I could find online. Copywriting for small businesses, data entry, social media scheduling for a dental office in Clovis and a real estate agent in Madera. $12 an hour, sometimes 15. Enough to cover my share of the household expenses and send a little back toward the credit card I'd had to use when the transition happened fast. I didn't complain. I didn't perform sacrifice. I just did the work. What I didn't know was that while I was doing the work, my mother was doing hers. The first family gathering after I took the leave was a birthday party for my cousin Jenna in November. My mother arrived before me. By the time I walked through the door, the room already had a shape to it. I could feel it the way you feel a temperature change. People looked at me with that specific softness that isn't warmth. It's pity wrapped in manners. My Aunt Carol pulled me aside near the drinks table and said, "Honey, your mom told us about school. Don't worry, lots of people take longer." I opened my mouth. Then I saw my mother across the room, watching me over the rim of her wine glass with an expression so carefully neutral it could only have been rehearsed. I closed my mouth. I smiled at Carol and said, "I'm doing fine." Because Dale was in the next room and this was Jenna's birthday, and some fights you don't have at other people's parties. I loaded a plate I didn't touch and sat in the corner and watched my mother receive sympathetic nods from 3 different relatives who believed they understood a situation they had been deliberately handed a false version of. On the drive back to Dale's house that night, I got a text from my cousin Jenna. It said, "Mom said you dropped out. Is that true?" I stared at that text for a long time at a red light on Shields Avenue. 7 words. The whole architecture of a lie delivered in 7 words to a 20-year-old at her own birthday party. I typed back, "No. I took a family medical leave." "Big difference." She replied with a thumbs up and nothing else. I put the phone in the cup holder and drove the rest of the way in silence. Dale was still awake when I got in. He was in the kitchen making decaf, which was the only kind Patrice allowed in the house now. He looked at my face and said, "Rough night?" I said, "Mom's talking." He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of me. He didn't say anything else for a while. Then he said, "She always talks, Melissa. The question is what you're going to build while she does." I wrapped my hands around that mug and I held on to those words like they were something solid. Because in that kitchen at that table with the Fresno night quiet outside the window, something in me made a decision. Not out loud. Not dramatically. Just a small internal shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself until years later when you look back and realize that was the moment. I was going to build something she couldn't talk over. I just didn't know yet what it was going to be. I want to tell you something about rock bottom that nobody talks about. It doesn't always look like falling apart. Sometimes it looks like holding everything together so tightly that your hands shake and nobody notices because you never let them see the shaking. That was me at 22, living in a spare bedroom in East Fresno, driving my uncle to heart rehab 3 mornings a week, freelancing for $12 an hour, and watching my savings account drain the way a bathtub drains when the plug is loose. Slow enough that you think you have time. Fast enough that one morning you check the number and feel the floor tilt under you. Dale was getting stronger. By February he could walk to the end of the block and back without stopping. By March he was back to driving himself to the grocery store, which Patrice hated but allowed because the alternative was listening to him complain about being treated like a fragile thing. I was proud of how far he'd come. I was also quietly terrified about what came next for me. My academic leave had an end date. My credits were waiting. But going back to campus meant going back to the apartment, the tuition payments, the full weight of a life I'd put on pause, and I had $740 in my checking account and a credit card balance that had grown in the dark like something I was pretending wasn't there. I started thinking differently during those months. Not about school, not about my mother's voice in my head cataloging everything I wasn't. I started thinking about the work I'd been doing from Dale's kitchen table. The freelance clients. The copywriting, the scheduling, the data organization. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it, and more importantly, I kept noticing the same problem across every small business I worked with. They had customers. They had products. They had zero idea how to talk about either one in a way that made people stop scrolling and pay attention. A bakery in Clovis with genuinely beautiful pastries and an Instagram that looked like a ransom note. A family-owned hardware store in Madeira that had been in business for 30 years and had 17 Google reviews, 14 of which were from people who had clearly never been there. A wedding photographer in Reedley who charged half what she was worth because she didn't know how to present herself online as someone worth full price. I started offering more than what they hired me for. Not for extra money, at least not at first. I just couldn't help it. I'd finish the social media scheduling and then write 3 paragraphs about why their current approach wasn't working and what a different one might look like. The bakery owner, a woman named Rosa, called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, "I don't know what you changed, but my DMs have been insane this week." That was February. By March, Rosa had referred me to 2 other business owners in the area. By April I had 8 clients and I was charging more because Rosa had told them what I charged and they'd said yes without blinking, which told me I'd been undervaluing myself since the beginning. I didn't go back to campus in the spring semester. I told myself it was temporary. I told Dale and Patrice I was going to take 1 more semester to get financially stable and then re-enroll. They didn't push. They understood in the way people understand things when they've watched you work from their kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night and never once complained about the light being on. What I didn't tell them, what I didn't tell anyone, was that something had shifted in me so completely that the idea of going back to a classroom to learn about marketing theory felt like being handed a map to a place I'd already figured out how to navigate on my own. I wasn't arrogant about it. I knew there were things I didn't know. But I also knew that the 8 business owners paying me actual money for actual results were teaching me things no textbook had ever gotten to. My mother found out I wasn't re-enrolling in June. Not from me. From my cousin Jenna, who had heard it from Aunt Carol, who had heard it from someone, and the chain of information in my family has always moved faster than the truth it was supposed to carry. Linda Mercer called me on a Sunday morning while I was building a new website for the hardware store in Madeira. She didn't open with hello. She opened with, "Tell me Jenna is wrong." I said, "I'm taking more time." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Not hurt. Fury very carefully controlled. "Melissa, you have 1 semester left." "I know, Mom." "Then go finish it. I'm building something right now. I'll go back when the time is right. You sound like your father when he was 24 and thought he was going to flip houses for a living." That landed exactly where she intended it to. My father's brief and disastrous real estate venture in his mid-20s was family legend. The cautionary tale she pulled out whenever one of us showed any sign of coloring outside the lines she'd drawn. "I'm not Dad," I said. "I'm making money." "Doing what?" "Digital marketing consulting for small businesses." Another silence. Then, with the precision of someone who has had years of practice, "That's not a career, Melissa. That's a hobby that pays." She hung up first. She always hung up first. What came next I didn't find out about until much later. But I need to tell you now so you understand the full weight of what I was carrying without knowing I was carrying it. 3 weeks after that phone call, a client I had been in final conversations with for 2 weeks, a mid-sized restaurant group in Visalia with 4 locations and a serious need for a full rebrand, went quiet. I'd sent the proposal. I'd had 2 calls with the owner, a man named Greg Stafford, and both had gone well. Then nothing. No response to my follow-up email. No answer when I called. I assumed I'd lost the bid to someone else. It happens. I moved on. What I didn't know then was that someone had called Greg Stafford's office. Not to pitch a competing service. To raise a concern. The person on the phone had described herself as a family member of the consultant he was considering hiring. She had expressed worry about my reliability, my lack of formal credentials, my tendency, according to her, to start things and not finish them. She had done it with the measured warmth of someone who genuinely hated to say it. She had done it without leaving her name. I found all of this out 14 months later when Greg Stafford, by then following my work online, reached out to apologize. He said, "I should have called you directly. I let one phone call make a decision that wasn't that person's to make." I asked him to describe the voice. He did. I already knew. I had known from the second he said family member. Here is what I want you to understand about that moment when I found out. I wasn't surprised. That's the part that broke something in me, not the betrayal itself, but the fact that I absorbed it like information I'd already prepared for without knowing I was preparing. When your own mother has spent enough years treating your potential like a liability, your nervous system stops registering shock. It just files the new evidence next to the old evidence and keeps moving. But I filed it carefully. I kept every detail Greg told me in a mental folder I did not intend to leave unopened forever. In the meantime, I kept building. I registered an LLC in July of that year. I called it Brightly Company, a digital marketing and brand consultancy. Nothing dramatic about the name. I wanted something clean, forward-facing, easy to say. I set up a proper website, opened a business checking account, and by August I had 11 clients and one part-time contractor, a graphic designer named Danny who worked remotely from Bakersfield and had a gift for making small businesses look like they'd been professionally handled for decades. Revenue that year, meaning the partial year from July to December, came to just over $61,000. Not enough to impress anyone at a dinner party. More than enough to make the floor stop tilting. The family gatherings during this period had a new dimension to them. My mother had refined her approach. It was no longer just the sad sigh and the lowered eyes. She had developed a more sophisticated technique, which was to speak about me with a specific kind of bewildered affection, like I was a puzzle she loved but couldn't quite solve. At my cousin Brian's engagement party in October, she told my Uncle Ray and his wife that I was doing some kind of online work, very Melissa, always doing her own thing. She said it with a smile that made it sound like a personality quirk rather than a profession. Uncle Ray, who I'd always liked, patted my arm across the table and said, "Don't worry, kid. Something will click eventually." He thought he was being kind. He was operating entirely on my mother's information. I looked down at my plate and did the math in my head. $61,000. 11 clients. One contractor. Something had already clicked. He just hadn't been told. Dale saw it differently. On a Sunday in November, I drove across town to have lunch with him and Patrice. He asked about the business the way he always did, with real questions, specific ones, not the polite surface version. How many clients now? What's the retention rate? Are you reinvesting or sitting on it? I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when I finished he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. It was respect. Clean, uncomplicated, with no asterisk attached. "You know your mother's going to say something at Christmas," he said. "I know. You ready for that?" I looked at him. I told him I was working on being ready for more than that. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute. I drove home through the flat Fresno evening with the windows down and the dry November air coming in, and I thought about the folder I was keeping in my head. The one with Greg Stafford's phone call inside it. The one I was adding to quietly, steadily, the way you add to anything you're building. One careful piece at a time. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being misrepresented by someone who loves you. It's different from the exhaustion of hard work or grief or even loneliness. It sits in a different part of you, somewhere between your chest and your throat, and it never fully goes away because it's not caused by something you did. It's caused by something being done to you repeatedly by someone who knows exactly what they're doing and calls it concern. By the time Brightly Company entered its second full year, I had learned to live with that exhaustion the way you learn to live with a bad knee. You adjust your stride. You stop expecting it to disappear. You just keep moving. Year 2 looked nothing like Year 1. Year 1 was survival disguised as momentum. Year 2 was actual momentum, and the difference between the two is something you feel in your body before you see it in the numbers. I had 19 clients by March, spanning Fresno, Visalia, Bakersfield, and 3 businesses elsewhere in the Central Valley that had found me through referrals I hadn't even tracked. Danny had moved from part-time to full-time and I had brought on a second contractor, a guy named Theo who handled paid advertising and had a mind for data that made me feel like I'd been doing long division by hand and had just discovered a calculator. Revenue for the full year landed at $218,000. I sat with that number for a long time the night I calculated it. Not celebrating. Just letting it be real. None of this existed in the version of me my family was carrying around in their heads. At every gathering, which in my family meant Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, and the occasional barbecue that someone decided was mandatory, I was still the same Melissa. The one who hadn't finished her degree. The one doing some internet thing that probably wasn't going to last. The one Linda Mercer worried about out loud in the company of anyone who would listen. I had stopped trying to correct the record after the second time I'd attempted it and watched my mother's eyes fill with tears so precisely timed that half the room turned to comfort her before I'd finished my sentence. She wasn't crying because she was hurt. She was crying because it was effective. The tears were a tool and she had been sharpening that tool for years. The Christmas gathering that year had a moment worth telling because it shows how refined the performance had become. My mother's younger brother, Uncle Gary, a man I had always respected for being direct, pulled me aside near the kitchen and said quietly, "Melissa, I know it's hard watching your sister's career take off. Don't compare yourself. Everyone finds their path eventually." He meant it with complete kindness. But I had never expressed feeling overshadowed by Courtney to anyone, not once. The only way Uncle Gary could have arrived at that specific interpretation was if someone had handed it to him already fully assembled. I thanked him and went back to the table and sat next to Dale, who looked at my face and said nothing, because Dale had been watching long enough to read my silences without needing a translation. What changed in year 2 wasn't the business. It was a conversation I had in the parking lot of a Vaughn's supermarket on a Saturday morning in April. Dale had driven over to pick up a prescription and spotted my car. He got in the passenger seat without asking, which was completely his way, and said without any opening pleasantry, "I heard what your mother said at Patrice's birthday last month." I hadn't been at that birthday. The weekend conflicted with a client presentation I couldn't reschedule, and I'd sent a card and a gift. My mother had apparently used my absence as a narrative device. According to Dale, she had told 3 separate people that I hadn't come because I was too embarrassed about where my life had ended up, that I was pulling away from the people who loved me. Dale had sat at the table and absorbed all of it without reacting, because he wanted to hear the full version before deciding what to do with it. I told him about Greg Stafford, the restaurant group in Visalia. The phone call someone had made to Greg's office describing me as unreliable, unfinished, not someone a serious company should take a chance on. I had never said this out loud to anyone before. Not Patrice. Not Courtney. I had held it alone because putting it into words felt like handing someone a reason to feel sorry for me, and I already had more of that than I knew what to do with. I watched Dale's face as I laid it out and watched the exact moment it landed, the way his jaw set and his eyes went completely still in the way that still eyes do when someone is containing something large. He didn't raise his voice. He asked one question. "Do you have anything in writing?" I told him I had Greg's apology email with every detail written in Greg's own words. Dale nodded. "Keep it somewhere safe." Then after a pause, "You know I have a newsletter." I did know. He had been writing a weekly small business digest for 4 years, circulated to a few thousand readers across the Central Valley. Local owners, regional investors, chamber regulars. He wasn't famous outside that specific world, but inside it people read what Dale Mercer wrote. "When you're ready," he said, "I want to write about what you've built." "Not yet," I told him. He nodded. "I'll be here." That was the conversation that changed something in me. Not the numbers, not the business. The witness. A truth you carry alone starts feeling like maybe you imagined the shape of it. Having Dale in that parking lot looking at me like someone who had done the math and arrived at the right answer, made the whole thing feel solid again. The contract that defined the second half of that year came in August. A regional grocery chain with 11 locations across the Central Valley needed a ground-up brand rebuild, new visual identity, new digital strategy, new community presence across every location. The contract was worth $340,000 over 18 months. I signed it in Hanford on a Wednesday, called Danny and Theo from the parking lot, and told them everything was about to get bigger. By September I had 5 full-time employees and a proper office leased in a converted warehouse on Fulton Street in downtown Fresno. Real desks, a conference room with a whiteboard covering one entire wall, A coffee machine. Theo had strong opinions about that. I let him choose because that argument wasn't worth my energy. It wasn't glamorous. But it was real and it was mine. My sister Courtney came to see it in late September. She had moved back to Fresno from Newport Beach in June after a long relationship ended and had been keeping mostly to herself. We had never been particularly close. We were civil, capable of the same room without friction, but we moved in orbits my mother had arranged to keep us from comparing notes too directly. Courtney called one Tuesday evening out of nowhere and asked if she could come see the office. No explanation. Just, "Can I come see what you've built?" I said yes out of surprise. She came on a Thursday, walked the space slowly, asked questions that were specific and intelligent. She asked to see the numbers. I pulled them up. She read without speaking for longer than I expected. Then she said quietly, "She has no idea, does she?" Not a question. I said no. She sat down in the conference room and stared at the whiteboard. "She called me last week," Courtney said. "She told me she thinks you might be depressed." I said I know. Courtney looked at me directly. "How long have you known she was doing this?" I thought about Jenna's text. The birthday party. The tears on perfect cue. The relatives who had been handed one version for so long they had stopped imagining another. "Since the beginning," I said. She went quiet. Then, "I never said anything. For years. I want you to know I understand what that cost you." I looked at her across the table. "I know you know." We stayed another hour and resolved nothing, because 6 years of accumulated weight is not something one afternoon can carry. But something shifted in that room. Not forgiveness yet. Something earlier and smaller and more honest than forgiveness. Two people finally looking at the same thing and agreeing on what they saw. By October the numbers were tracking to clear $400,000 for the year. 7 employees. 26 clients. And I had said nothing to my mother. Not a word of correction at any dinner table, not a single message sent to reclaim anything she had circulated about me for years. I was holding everything carefully, the way you hold something you know exactly what to do with and are simply waiting for the right moment. Dale had his newsletter. I had the screenshot and the records in the office on Fulton Street. Courtney had a conscience that was finally waking up. And Christmas was 11 weeks out. The group text had already arrived. 41 people. Her house in Clovis. She had written that it had been a challenging year for some of us and she hoped the whole family would show up for each other. The some of us was not subtle. It never had been. I read it, set my phone down on my desk and looked out the window at the Fulton Street sidewalk where a woman was walking a dog far too large for its leash. I thought about Dale in that parking lot. I thought about the screenshot. I thought about Courtney's face when she finally saw the numbers. Then I picked up my phone and typed one word into the group chat. Coming. My mother's house in Clovis smelled like pine candles and slow-cooked ham when I walked through the front door at 3:30 on Christmas afternoon. She had decorated the way she always decorated for the holidays, which is to say excessively and with the precision of someone who had been planning it since October. Garland on the staircase banister. A wreath on every interior door. A centerpiece on the dining table involving real candles, eucalyptus branches and small gold ornaments arranged in a way that looked effortless and had absolutely taken hours. 41 people filled the rooms. I could feel the noise of it from the driveway before I even opened the door. I had driven alone. Courtney was already there, her coat on the rack near the entrance. Dale and Patrice had come separately. I hung my jacket, scanned the living room, and felt the familiar temperature of a gathering that had been pre-shaped before I arrived. My mother was near the kitchen, burgundy blouse, hair freshly done, a glass of sparkling water in her hand because she never drank at her own events. She said it was because she wanted to stay present for her guests, which was true, though the version of present she meant required full control of her surroundings. She saw me come in, smiled and said, "Melissa, you made it." The warmth in her voice was calibrated precisely. Enough to seem genuine. Not enough to be mistaken for relief. I found Dale near the back of the living room talking to Uncle Gary. He caught my eye and gave a small nod, the kind that communicates something without words. I nodded back. Courtney was at the drinks table. She looked up when I walked over and said quietly, "You okay?" I said yes. She held my gaze a second longer than the question required, then handed me a glass of water. My father was somewhere near the hallway, performing the specific kind of non-presence he had perfected over 20 years of attending events in this house without ever fully arriving in them. Dinner was called at 5. The long table stretched through the dining room and into the connected sitting area, 2 tables made to look like one under a cream tablecloth my mother had ironed that morning, which I knew because she had mentioned it to 3 people before I arrived. I sat near the middle. Dale was at the far end. Courtney was across from me 2 seats down. My mother stood at the head of the table and lifted her glass for the toast. She thanked everyone for coming. She mentioned my cousin Brian's new job in Sacramento. She mentioned Uncle Gary's retirement. Then her gaze moved to Courtney and she said that watching her daughter rebuild after a difficult year had reminded her what resilience looked like. Courtney's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked at her plate. Then my mother's gaze moved further down the table with the slow deliberateness of someone who had mapped the route in advance, and it landed on me. She tilted her head. That specific tilt, the one she had been using for 6 years. "And Melissa," she said, her voice dropping just slightly, "we just keep hoping. We keep the door open and we keep hoping." A few sympathetic smiles from relatives who had attended enough of these performances to know their cue. I set my fork down and kept my face completely still. The meal continued. Turkey, mashed potatoes, the same 7 dishes she had been making for 20 years. Conversation moved around the table in currents, and I let it move without joining it. Listening. Watching. It was during dessert that my mother made her real move. The table had loosened the way long tables do after a full meal, smaller side conversations starting up, chairs pushed back slightly, the formal structure giving way to something easier. My mother was speaking to a family friend named Brenda, 2 seats down, close enough that I was meant to overhear. "I don't know what else to do," she was saying, her voice carrying that specific weight she used when she wanted to seem burdened by love. "We've offered to help financially to help her get back on her feet, but she refuses everything. She seems almost angry at us for trying." Brenda made a sound of sympathy. "I think it's pride," my mother continued. "She was always so proud. And sometimes pride is the thing that holds people back the most." She paused. "I just worry that she'll wake up at 40 and realize she spent her 20s being stubborn." Brenda nodded. "It must be so hard for you." My mother pressed her hand to her chest. "It is. It really is." I set my dessert fork down on the plate, not loudly, and looked at my mother across the table. "I don't need to get back on my feet, Mom. I've been standing for a while now." She looked up. Her expression moved through 3 phases: surprise, recalibration, practiced concern. "Melissa, I have 7 employees," I said. "I have 26 clients across the Central Valley. I have been building something for 3 years that you have never once asked about." The table nearest us went quiet. My father looked up from his coffee. Brenda sat very still. My mother's chin lifted. "I ask about your life all the time," she said. "You just never want to talk." And here is where it might have stayed. A familiar circular disagreement, the kind that gets absorbed back into the noise of a family dinner without leaving a mark. Except that Dale's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up reflexively without expectation, the way anyone checks a phone at dinner. He looked at the screen. He looked at it again. He set it down, then picked it right back up. His face changed in the way faces change when they encounter something they weren't prepared for, a slow rearrangement of features that comes just ahead of full comprehension. I watched him from across the table and felt something in my chest go completely still. I knew what was on that phone. I just hadn't known it would be tonight. Dale had published his newsletter that afternoon. He had told me 2 weeks before that he was running a feature on a Central Valley business he'd been watching quietly for 3 years. He had not given me the published date. He had simply said, "When you're ready, I'll run it." I had told him I was ready. I hadn't thought to ask when. The newsletter went out at 4:30 that afternoon, 90 minutes into Christmas dinner at my mother's house in Clovis. The feature was titled, "The Quiet Builder: How a Fresno Founder Grew a Brand Consultancy to $2.1 million Without Anyone in Her Family Knowing." My name was in it. My real name. My photo taken for a regional business journal 3 months earlier. And the number 3 years of revenue laid out plainly for 4,000 readers across the Central Valley, a significant portion of whom were currently sitting at their own holiday tables pulling out their phones. Uncle Gary found it first. He made a sound I had never heard from him before, a short involuntary exhale that escaped before his brain had finished processing what his eyes were reading. He turned his phone toward my cousin Brian. Brian read it. His eyes came up and found me across the table. Then Courtney's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and I watched her face do the exact thing Dale's face had done 30 seconds earlier. The slow comprehension, the recalculation, understanding, catching up to information. She looked at me. I looked back at her and neither of us said anything. My father reached into his jacket pocket, looked at his phone and went completely still. The quiet spread from the far end of the table toward the center, moving through the room the way temperature moves through water, gradually and then all at once. My mother looked around at the faces turning towards screens. "What is everyone looking at?" she said. Nobody answered. Dale set his phone face up on the table and looked at me from the far end of the room. He didn't say my name. The way he looked at me said everything that needed saying. "You built it. Here it is. Now they know." My mother reached toward Brenda and said, "What is that?" Brenda turned the screen toward her without speaking. I watched my mother's face and I want to describe it accurately, because I had imagined this moment on hard nights and I had imagined it wrong every time. I had imagined something dramatic, her face crumpling or hardening or flushing red. What it actually did was go quiet. Not blank, not frozen. Quiet. The way a room goes quiet when the sound filling it has suddenly stopped and the absence is louder than the noise ever was. She read the screen. She read it again. She looked at the number in the headline. Then she looked up at me. For the first time in 6 years, in front of 41 people, in the house she had decorated and the dinner she had cooked and the room she had arranged specifically to control, my mother had nothing to say. Not a tilt of the head, not a manufactured tear. Not a soft redirecting comment about hope or worry or open doors. Nothing. Complete, unscripted, total silence. And in that silence, 6 years of a story she had been telling came apart in the time it takes to read a headline. The room was looking at me. All of it all at once. And this time the way they looked was different. Not pity. Not sympathy offered in the direction of the wrong person. Something else entirely. Something that had been a long time coming and had just finally arrived. Uncle Gary was the first person to speak after the silence. Not loudly. Not with any fanfare. He just looked down the table at me and said, "Melissa, is this you?" His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Not the gentle pity-tinged tone he had used in past years. This was something steadier and more direct, the voice he used when he was being serious. I said yes. He nodded slowly, looked at the phone again, looked back at me. Across the room my father sat with his hands flat on the tablecloth and stared at a fixed point somewhere between his coffee cup and the centerpiece and said nothing. But he didn't look away from it. He stayed present in the room in a way I had rarely seen him manage before. The room held its breath for longer than felt comfortable. 41 people and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and someone's chair scraping the floor as they shifted weight. My mother was still holding Brenda's phone. She was looking at the screen the way you look at something when your brain is refusing to organize what your eyes are giving it. I watched her from across the table and felt something I had not expected. Not triumph. Not the clean vindication I had rehearsed on the worst nights years ago. What I felt was closer to grief. Not for myself. For the 6 years that could have gone differently if she had simply chosen to ask instead of assume, to listen instead of narrate. You can be right about someone and still grieve the version of them you needed them to be. My mother set the phone down. She looked around the room and for the first time in my memory she had no next move. Every gathering, every dinner, every conversation within these walls had been shaped by her. She was the one who decided the story. And now the story had been decided without her, in front of everyone she had ever told it to. Uncle Gary cleared his throat and looked at her directly. "Linda, did you know about any of this?" She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I knew she was doing some work," she said. Her voice had lost its texture completely. The performance quality was gone. What remained sounded thin and uncertain, the voice of someone who has been using a costume so long they have forgotten what their real face looks like. I didn't know the scale. Gary looked at her, then at me. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" The answer was simpler than any version I had rehearsed. "Because the last time I tried," I said, "the room believed her version instead of mine." Several people looked at Linda. She did not look back at any of them. Courtney spoke next. She had been still for several minutes, hands in her lap. When she raised her head her voice was even and deliberate. The voice she used professionally, the one that didn't ask permission. "Mom called me 3 weeks ago and said she thought Melissa might be struggling with her mental health. That we should give her space but keep checking in. Pause. I'm realizing that phone call was not about Melissa's well-being. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Brenda looked at her hands. Uncle Gary sat back in his chair. My father, who had been a statue at the far end of the room, slowly set down his coffee cup and looked at Linda with the expression of a man who has spent 20 years looking away from something and has decided he is finally tired of the angle. My mother stood and walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps louder than usual on the hardwood. She stopped at the doorway and turned. I have always done everything for this family. Everything I have ever done has been to protect this family. Dale spoke from the far end of the table, quiet and level. You called a client of hers, Linda. In 2019. A restaurant group in Visalia. You told the owner she was unreliable. My mother's face did not move. I don't know what you're talking about. Dale reached into his shirt pocket and set his phone on the table face up. I have the email. Greg Stafford sent it to Melissa when he reached out to apologize. Every detail of the call is in his own words. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. The fact of its existence, stated plainly in that room in front of 41 people, was enough. I watched my mother look at that phone, and I watched the moment she understood there was no version of this conversation she could steer. Not with tears, not with redirected concern, not with the long-practiced art of making herself the center of someone else's pain. I stood up. Not because I was angry. I had burned through the hot part of my anger years ago, and what remained was cooler and more deliberate. I stood because I had things to say, and I wanted to say them on my feet. I looked at my mother in the doorway. I'm not doing this in front of everyone, I said. But I need you to hear 3 things. Her chin was up, but her shoulders had dropped slightly, the posture of someone who already knows the outcome and is managing how they land. 1. Before New Year's, you tell every person at this table the actual reason I left school. Not your version. The real one. In your own words, in your own time, but before the year ends. She didn't respond. 2. You stop speaking on my behalf to anyone. Not to relatives, not to family friends, not to anyone connected to my work. If someone asks about me, you tell them to ask me directly. A muscle in her jaw tightened. 3. You see a therapist. Not to make me feel better. Because you need it. I finished with the part that mattered most. If those 3 things don't happen, I won't be coming back to this table. Not at Christmas, not at Thanksgiving, not at any gathering. And that will be a choice you made, not one I made. My father's voice came from behind me. Low and quiet, the voice of a man spending words carefully because he had spent so few where they were needed. She's right, Linda. All 3. My mother looked at my father for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I couldn't name, something old and complicated and not entirely about tonight. Then she went into the kitchen and the door swung shut behind her and the room let out a long collective breath. The gathering dissolved the way gatherings do when the thing everyone came for has already happened. People found their coats. Uncle Gary hugged me at the front door and held on an extra second. Brian shook my hand and said congratulations in a voice that carried more than the word. Patrice found me near the coat rack and took both my hands in hers. She said, Dale has been waiting to do that for 3 years. I said I know. She squeezed once and let go. Courtney found me in the driveway. The December air was cold and flat, the particular Fresno winter cold that carries weight without drama. We stood side by side looking at the street. Then she said, I'm sorry I waited so long. I said I know. She said, that's not enough. I looked at her. No, I said. But it's where we start. She nodded. She looked like she had more to say and didn't know how to organize it yet, which was honest, and honest was something I had more respect for than anything polished. We stood there until the cold moved us back to our cars, and then we drove away in separate directions through the quiet Clovis streets. I called Dale from a gas station parking lot on Herndon Avenue. He picked up before the second ring. I said, you published it on Christmas. He said, you told me you were ready. I said, I didn't know you meant today. Pause. Then, did it go the way you needed it to? I thought about my mother's face when she read the screen. I thought about my father's 2 sentences. I thought about Courtney in the driveway. I thought about 6 years of the same table and the same look in the same story. Yes, I said. It did. He said, good. Merry Christmas, kid. I said Merry Christmas and drove home through the flat, dark Central Valley night with the heater on and the radio off, Just the road and the quiet and the clean particular feeling of something long unfinished finally being done. My mother completed 2 of the 3 conditions before New Year's. He called Uncle Gary. She called Brian and his wife. She called Brenda, which I suspect was the hardest because Brenda had been in the room. Courtney told me about each call. She said our mother cried on all of them, the real kind, without an audience in mind. The 3rd condition came in January. A single text. I made an appointment. 4 words. I read them twice and saved the message without responding because it was a start, and I had learned over 6 years that everything real begins somewhere small and easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. Brightly Company cleared $2.4 million the following year. 2 new hires, a second office, and the first contracts outside California. I went back to my mother's table in February. Not for a gathering. Just dinner. The 4 of us, quiet and careful, nothing resolved in any final way because families don't resolve, they adjust. My mother asked about the business with real questions. My father talked more than I had ever heard him talk at a family dinner. Courtney made a joke that actually landed and we all laughed, and the laugh was completely real, every part of it. It wasn't the family I needed when I was 21 driving to cardiac rehab in the Fresno dark. But I was 27 now, and the people across that table were honest in a way they had never been before. Honest is the only place anything real ever starts. My name is Melissa Mercer. I spent 6 years being called the broke one. I built something in silence because silence was the only space they left me. And then one Christmas afternoon an uncle's phone buzzed on a dinner table and the silence spoke for itself. I didn't engineer the timing. I didn't plan the ending. I just kept building and stayed standing and let the truth arrive when it was ready. It always arrives. You just have to make sure you're still there when it does. 18 months. That is how long it took for the dust from that Christmas dinner to settle into something resembling a new normal. Not a perfect normal. Not the kind you see in movies where everyone cries in a parking lot and shows up to the next holiday with fresh eyes and clean slates and a soundtrack that tells you how to feel. The real kind of normal, which is slower and messier and involves people taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back and sometimes just standing completely still because they don't know which direction is forward anymore. 18 months is also how long it took me to understand that what happened at that dinner table in Clovis was not the end of the story. It was the moment the real story finally had permission to begin. It is March now. I am 29 years old. I am sitting in the new Brightly Company office on Van Ness Avenue in Fresno, which is larger than the Fulton Street space by about 3 times and still somehow always feels slightly too small for what we are trying to do inside it. We have 14 full-time employees. We have 43 active clients across California, Nevada, and Arizona. Last quarter's revenue came in just under $1 million for a single 3-month period, which puts us on track to close the year somewhere above $3.5 million. I do not say these numbers to impress anyone. I say them because for 6 years the people who were supposed to know me best operated on the assumption that I had nothing, was building nothing, and would amount to nothing. The numbers are not the point. The numbers are just the most legible version of the truth, the version that requires no interpretation, no context, no qualifier attached. Dale had his 61st birthday in January. We threw him a dinner at a restaurant on Olive Avenue, nothing formal, just the people who actually showed up when it counted. Patrice, Danny and Theo from the early days, who have been with Brightly Company long enough that they feel less like employees and more like the founding architecture of something that outlasted the doubt. My cousin Brian and his wife, who have been quietly present in my life in the 18 months since Christmas in a way they never were before that dinner. Uncle Gary, who called me on a random Wednesday last April just to say he had been thinking about what I said at that table and that he was sorry he had believed the wrong version for so long. That call lasted 40 minutes and I spent the last 10 standing outside the office on the sidewalk because I needed the air, and the air was honest in a way the inside of the building wasn't at that particular moment. Dale wore the same slightly too loud button-down he wore to every occasion that required a button-down. He gave a toast at his own birthday dinner, which nobody had asked him to do and which was therefore completely in character for him. He said, short and clean, that the best thing a person could do with the years they had left after a heart attack was spend them watching the people they loved prove everyone wrong. He looked at me when he said it. I looked at my water glass. The table laughed. I managed not to cry, which I considered a personal victory of meaningful proportion. My father drove up from Bakersfield in October. He had moved there 8 months after the Christmas dinner, quietly and without much announcement, into a small house near his brother's place on the east side of the city. He and my mother had separated in the spring, which was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention for more than 5 minutes, and which I had complicated feelings about that I was actively working through in therapy at a pace my therapist described as honest if not exactly fast. He called ahead before the October visit and asked if I had time for lunch. We ate at a diner on Shaw Avenue and talked for 2 hours. It was the longest continuous conversation I had ever had with my father in my adult life. He asked about the business with the specific careful attention of someone who is trying hard to do something right that they have done wrong for a long time. He asked about Dale. He asked about Courtney. Near the end he asked if I had heard from my mother. I told him we spoke once a month, 15 or 20 minutes, factual and civil, the early scaffolding of something that might eventually become more than that. He nodded and said he was glad. He left a 20 on the table for a $12 check, shook my hand and said he hoped I would let him do this again sometime. I said I would. I meant it. That is not nothing. I have learned to measure progress in much smaller units than I used to. My mother has been in therapy since January of last year, every other week 15 months and still going, which is honestly longer than I expected and longer than I would have bet on when that forward text arrived in January and I saved it without responding. She called me in August on an unscheduled Tuesday afternoon. She said she had talked about the internship call in her session and that her therapist had encouraged her to say something to me directly. She said, I knew it was wrong when I did it. I knew before I even dialed the number and I did it anyway because I was afraid of what it meant if you succeeded without needing me. I want you to know that I know that. The line held quiet for a moment. I said, I know you know. She said, I'm not asking you to forgive me yet. I said, I know. We stayed on the phone a few more minutes talking about small things, the weather, a recipe, whether the Fresno heat was going to be as relentless as the forecast suggested. Normal things. The kind of things people talk about when they are trying to practice being in each other's lives again without the full weight of the whole history pressing down on every sentence. When we hung up I sat in the parking lot and thought about the word yet. I'm not asking you to forgive me yet. That yet was doing real work in that sentence. I appreciated the honesty of it more than I expected to. Courtney and I have lunch on the third Saturday of every month. It started in February of last year when she texted out of nowhere and asked if I wanted to get food and we ended up at a Vietnamese place on Blackstone Avenue and stayed for 3 hours talking and not talking in equal measure. We have kept it every month since without making a formal agreement to do so, which means we both just keep showing up, which is its own kind of agreement. We don't always talk about our mother or our father or the years of silence or any of the obvious weight. Sometimes we talk about her work. She changed firms in the spring and is doing something she actually chose rather than something our mother chose for her, which has made her noticeably different in ways that are difficult to describe but immediately easy to feel when you're sitting across from her. Last month she told me she had started painting again for the first time since college. Small canvases, nothing serious she said, though the way she said it made clear she hoped it might become serious. I told her that was the best thing she had told me in months. She looked up from her phone and said, "You're going soft, Melissa." I said maybe. We split the check. We always split the check. Feels important to split the check. I started teaching a 10-week workshop at a small business development center on Fulton Street, 2 blocks from my first office, for entrepreneurs in the early stages of building something real. Most of them are in their 20s. All of them are trying to make something out of an idea in an environment that is not always convinced the idea deserves to exist. The first session I asked the room to raise their hand if someone close to them had told them this was probably not going to work. Every single hand went up. I stood at the front looking at 14 raised hands and thought about a kitchen in East Fresno and a parking lot in April and a Christmas dinner in Clovis that went very differently than my mother had planned. I said, "Keep your hands up until I tell you to put them down." I talked for 20 minutes about what it means to build something when the people who are supposed to believe in you are the loudest voices betting against you. Then I told them to put their hands down and we got to work. 3 cohorts now. I don't charge for it. It isn't something I planned. It is something I cannot not do. Dale asked me recently what I would tell my 21-year-old self if I had the chance. We were eating takeout on the floor of his living room because the dining table was covered in newsletter work, which it always is, and the floor is where we always end up when we're being honest with each other. I thought about it longer than the question probably required. I thought about the drive to Community Regional in the dark. The Vaughn's parking lot. The Christmas dinner. The 4 words in a text in January. I thought about the distance between who I was when I took that leave of absence and who I am in this office on Van Ness Avenue with 14 people and a whiteboard that never quite gets fully erased. I said I would tell her that the silence they give you is not a punishment. It is real estate. Build on it. Dale nodded slowly, reached for another piece of takeout and said, put that in the workshop. I probably will. Some things take a long time to find the right words for, and then when you find them they feel like they were always there waiting. You just had to get quiet enough to hear them. I got very quiet for a very long time. And look at what grew. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.